Welcome, Confidenciales. This is a breaking news for analysis and reflection. The judge is waiting, who might open our minds to the current situation our country is experiencing. Judge Villegas, someone you often see on television and know. Our friends in Guadalajara are lucky to have him as their investigating judge. He is one of the few who stands up, who tells it like it is, and who gives us encouragement and strength in moments of discouragement. Every week, 20, 30, 40 more people under investigation. The number of people under investigation is already double the number of deputies that the PSOE has. But here, no one resigns. Some are in prison, many are convicted. The wheel keeps turning, and it's thanks to justice. Some judges, like Judge Villegas, who defend the rule of law regardless of who is involved, who believe and practice that the law is equal for everyone. There are very few, as we always say, just a handful of judges, a few prosecutors, some journalists, fewer and fewer, and the civil guard and national police. Not their bosses, most of whom have ended up under investigation, but those who investigate on the ground, who often risk their jobs for the truth. They are the ones who defend the rule of law in Spain during difficult times. And make no mistake, we are in a state of emergency. There are those who claim this is a slow-motion coup. It's quite possible that's the case. But we are stopping them in their tracks. The last few days have been especially dramatic for them. They're worried, they're squirming because they know they've been caught and it's only a matter of time before everything comes out. That is the part of the rule of law that they still haven't been able to destroy and which is very well represented by our guest today. What's going to happen to justice in Spain with the Bolaños law? The king could do more than he does. Why would the request to lift parliamentary immunity allow Congress to ensure that Sanchez, if he were indicted, might not be tried? Are we living in a dictatorship? Are we on the way to becoming Venezuela, or are we already Venezuela? Only €2, 2.03 euros per month. Protect yourself with CyberGhost VPN. Judge Jesus Villegas, how are you?
Hello, good morning. It's a real pleasure to greet you.
The pleasure is mine. Are we in a critical situation, or am I exaggerating?
Well, we have never experienced such a serious situation in Spain. But look, that's how the fight against crime works. There have always been mobsters, there have always been drug traffickers, there have always been mafias, organized crime. The only thing that happens is that when these criminals are in positions of power, when they're in the highest institutions of the state, they're pursued just like any others. They make more noise, but there have always been criminals. Police officers and Guardia Civil officers have always been there against them, and it doesn't matter whether they're at the top or at the bottom.
What changes everything now is that these people have all the powers of the state in their favor. We're seeing the state legal service, part of the prosecutor's office, security forces, media, and public money being used without restraint. That's different from another organized group, isn't it?
Well, in some countries, crime is carried out using the machinery of the state, and we're talking about narco states, about failed states. Fortunately, Spain is very, very, very far from that, but it is true that crime and criminality can sometimes feed off the state, and then we find ourselves like puppets in the hands of criminals. Now then, let's put things in their place. This is simply a maneuver by certain criminals and delinquents. The Spanish state is still healthy. The judges are there, the police are there, and above all, there are citizens who don't put up with this. No, I mean, let's not make a mountain out of a molehill. This is extremely serious, but precisely because we are reacting, precisely because we have effective institutions, that's why we know about it. Look, what would really be serious is if we didn't know about it, if we thought everything was fine, as if a rotten apple had a worm inside and we were swallowing it without realizing it.
But you understand that we are afraid of ending up like Venezuela, and the path is the same.
Well, those who want to destroy the rule of law always follow a pattern. They follow a script in a systematic campaign that indeed starts with the judges. What do? They are marked, they are singled out, just like the mobsters do. They are identified and subjected to a public smear campaign. They try to dig up dirt on them. And then, when public opinion is already prepared, legislative reforms are made to put an end to judicial independence. Well, judicial, it's simply a manual for the corrupt, the criminal, the delinquent, and in a way also a manual for a coup d'etat, because it's a different kind of coup. Right? It doesn't mean sending tanks into the streets and taking over the key points of the country, but simply infiltrating like a cancer, like a metastasis that spreads through the different institutions.
Do you think we're in that situation, that we're suffering a slow motion coup d'etat?
Well, what I think is that there are people who would like it to be that way. And indeed, there are those who are bent on making things happen that way. But look, honestly, I say this with complete sincerity. Spain is not Venezuela. Spain is not Mexico. And notice that the facts prove what I'm saying. How are we reacting? What's happening? What's going on? Precisely, it's painful because the illness is being treated. Look, when you have an infected wound, you have to use the scalpel. And sometimes there's not even anesthesia. It hurts, but it's the pain that's necessary for healing. Really, look, I just want to see it from another point of view. It excites me that an attorney general, such an important person, has been convicted because it shows that we are all equal before the law. It excites me to see that it's coming out that someone like Zapatero is being investigated. Well, we don't know if he's innocent or guilty, but I want to say that he was like a kind of sacred cow, a totem, a guru for certain ideological circles, and now he's being investigated. Here, there are no barriers high enough to prevent justice, the police, or the rule of law from breaking through.
Yes, but they've contaminated everything. You compare this to a disease and the infection has spread to almost every organ in the body. Are you sure it won't end up killing the patient?
Well, look, they say that doctors win battles but lose the war because in the end, the patient always dies. But look, I assure you of one thing, democracy, the rule of law, and justice in Spain, we are not going to die. We are going to resist. What is true, and you mentioned it at the beginning of your speech, is that, of course, this is a storm. It's a tremendous situation. But what will happen? We'll see. What's truly concerning is they might enact legal reforms that let this continue in the future. The scoundrels who are currently under the scrutiny of justice will end up being judged, and if they are guilty, they will be punished with all the severity that the law allows. But what happens if they change the laws? That is what truly worries me, especially that they might be able to hand the investigation over to prosecutors.
Is it going to happen? Are they going to do it?
Look, the issue of prosecutors handling investigations worries me a lot because, unfortunately, that's not something new. That, well, in Spain came up during the late Franco era, when Franco was on his deathbed and the regime saw it was losing power. There were independent judges, and of course, what better than handing investigations to prosecutors who were dependent on the government? And from there, it's an idea that was brought back. The left did it, but in reality, it's an idea of reactionary origin. In Spain, well, we copied it from abroad, but in Europe, the first experience was introduced by Nazi Germany. And in the United States, it's a tool of the most reactionary right. But when it comes to saving your own skin, you don't care if the goods are red or blue or where they come from. Well, as Emperor Vespasian said, you mentioned the Roman era at the beginning, money doesn't stink. That was about some taxes they imposed on latrines. Excrement may smell terrible, but the money we get from it, obviously we don't care where it comes from. So what I mean is that if a crime isn't investigated by an independent authority and is instead replaced by an autonomous authority that has more or less political connections, then in the future what we'll have is impunity. So we might seem to be at ease thinking that everything is fine because the media, because the headlines don't talk about corruption, but our safety will be at risk. And if you allow me, I'll connect this to the current situation. Look, what worries me is something different from what is usually said. Some people say, of course, if an authority with ties to politics or the government is investigating, they're just going to turn a blind eye so their friends don't end up in court. Does that sound familiar to you? To Mr. Albert? But that's not what worries me the most. What worries me is the opposite, that the police and public institutions are used to go after innocent people, to fabricate plots, to put people who are enemies of those in power in jail. And you might say, that's just delusional. Those things only happen in the movies. Well, just look at the plumber scheme, regardless of whether it's proven or not. That's another matter. I mean, that's exactly what it's about. It's exactly about that, about fabricating false stories to take down police officers, judges, and prosecutors. That's the problem. That's the problem that a criminal investigation with political connections would have, a criminal investigation led by an authority that isn't independent. Mr. Albert, you know how serious it is to be under investigation. To you and to me, in a procedure that isn't controlled by judges, they can open a file and say anything. Come on, this has actually happened. It happens in other countries. It happens in places where criminal investigations aren't overseen by judges, where a file might say we're a drunk, that we use prostitutes, or that we're drug addicts. They can make that up because from the moment there's no control by judicial authorities, anything is possible.
Well, I went through that myself. In Catalonia, during the Procés, the Mossos d'Esquadra made reports without a court order. And in one of them, my image, my photograph, my political affiliation, my political interests or concerns appeared. I reported it. They told me I wasn't right at any level, and I ended up losing at the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. Although that's another story, but for example, investigating a journalist without a court order is a common occurrence in our country. I know you want to give me a positive outlook on the future, and I agree with you that the events of everyday life give us strength and encouragement. But look, civil society, you and I are part of it. We have the feeling that if you and I were from the PSOE and we were criminals, we would always have Candido Conde Pumpido to make the charge disappear. But if we're not from the party, then no. How do we get rid of that feeling of impunity which we've seen is real from the minds of Spaniards?
Well, that's quite a topic you've just brought up. That really is truly serious. Anyway, well, everything is serious, but I mean that this really borders on scandal. Anyway, I'm going to make a small clarification about what you said earlier regarding the investigations you were a victim of. Look, what you're describing right now is illegal in Spain. The problem is that with the legal reforms they want to implement, it would be legal. That's the difference. And then look, in the Constitutional Court, first of all, indulge me for a moment, a touch of professional pride and self-vindication. The Constitutional Court is not made up of judges, mind you. I'm not in the same category as them. Spanish judges are not from the same group as them. They are magistrates because that's actually the title they have, but a magistrate, well, it's a word that's used for any public office. A mayor is a magistrate, the judge, the king. He is a magistrate. Even we judges are magistrates, but it's an archaic use of the term, so to speak. Those are gentlemen who are there, who have all the trappings of a court. It's true, they're in a court. They do everything. They issue rulings, everything you want, but they're not judges. No, they don't belong to the judiciary. They have been chosen by politicians, by the parliamentary chambers. And unfortunately, they are dragging the institution through the mud. They are making Spanish citizens lose confidence in constitutional justice. And why is this happening? That is to say, it's not about insulting or criticizing. That's not our style. At least it shouldn't be the style of judges or of people who reason and go beyond demagoguery. Look, I'll explain it to you because the Constitutional Court should be there to see if the laws are constitutional or not, to study whether the legal system complies with constitutional principles. But when the Constitutional Court starts to assess the evidence, as happened in the ERE case, then they're simply taking the place of the Supreme Court, of the ordinary courts. That's extremely serious because what's happening is that the Constitutional Court is placing itself as if it were the Supreme Court of Spain, the Super Supreme Court, a Supreme that what's above the Supreme? And of course, this is destroying trust of public opinion and justice, making people think that those gentlemen are judges or that we belong to those bodies when real judges have nothing to do with them. And it's emboldening. It's giving hope to the corrupt, to criminals. That's why I was saying that this is simply a flaw, a crack in the architecture of the state, which I truly believe could bring it down. Because the other things aren't here yet. Who knows what will happen in the future? But this is right here. And Mr. Albert, what solution could we have for this? I mean, because I don't want to fall into this victim mentality of those who are just sitting around drinking coffee all the time, complaining that this is a disaster, that we're going to end up like Venezuela. That's what our enemies want us to do. We have to be positive and fight back, quote unquote, with the law and with justice. Well, let me tell you, there are serious professors in the academic field, scholars, highly prestigious jurists. What they are proposing is that the Constitutional Court should only deal with constitutional issues and challenges to see if the laws comply with the Constitution or not. But when it comes to resolving constitutional rights appeals, lawsuits, matters involving you and me, people whose rights and freedoms are at stake, litigants with specific names and surnames, those should go to the Supreme Court. The Constitutional Court should be restricted to analyzing the constitutionality of laws. And when there is a trial where the rights and freedoms of citizens are at stake, real judges should handle it.
I hope we get to see that. And a couple more questions. How was it allowed that if the Supreme Court decides to indict the Prime Minister, the Congress of Deputies has to grant permission? The judge should have that authority and be allowed to do it with a request for authorization. And if the majority of Congress says no, the case investigating an alleged criminal, in this case, the Prime Minister, is closed. How can it be that the judiciary bows down to the politician?
Well, incredible. That's what's called a request for authorization. And the thing is, as it's written now, it comes from a law from 1912, and it was a different time. A lot has happened since then. Look, having to request authorization from the chambers to investigate the Prime Minister, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because it's a way for the legislative branch to protect itself from unfounded lawsuits or accusations. I'll explain for our listeners in a simple way why that is. If it turns out that you have a political party, you are the Prime Minister, and you have the support of a parliamentary group, and you have just a few votes, a few seats in the Congress or the Senate supporting you, 2, 3, so you're just barely there. So it turns out that your political enemies can go to the courts, file criminal complaints against those deputies of yours, have them indicted, have them lose their positions, and then you lose the majority. That's what the request for waiver of immunity is for, and that's well thought out, so that parliamentary majorities can't be improperly altered by going to the courts for illegitimate purposes. Okay? That's good. What is truly outrageous, what is monstrous, is that once the request for waiver of immunity is made, if it's denied, then you just walk away scot-free. Careful, okay, if I were the Prime Minister, I'd be calling my friends to make a request for waiver of immunity, to file a complaint so that the judges would issue that request. That doesn't make any sense at all, and that's what needs to be reformed. Anyway, let me tell you something. Look, what would happen if tomorrow a request for waiver of immunity is made for the Prime Minister and the parliamentary chambers, using their political majority, deny it? Does he get off scot-free? In theory, yes. But let me tell you, that would be so serious, it would truly be, in my view, a constitutional coup d'etat that is absolutely inadmissible. But that could be appealed. There is legal scholarship supporting that. There is even case law from the Constitutional Court. One could go to court, one could go to the Constitutional Court to say that this denial was not fair, but simply a tool used by politicians to protect criminals, their own people. The problem is that, as you said, the noose is tightly around the neck of justice. Because, of course, if the final decision is in the hands of Mr. Conde Pumpido, the circle is closed. That is truly worrying. But you know what I say? I don't think he'll dare.
Yeah, well, I don't think they'll dare isn't very reassuring. In the end, it feels like they've done it, that we're winning battles, but they're still winning the war, and it's been 8 years. In all of this, the highest institution in the country is the king. And Okay, yes, he can't engage in politics, but he does have to defend the Constitution, the rule of law, the separation of powers, and a good part of that was being undermined. Should the king do more than what he's doing, or rather, should he do anything at all?
Well, we're dealing with a completely different issue, which is that of the monarchy. They say that the monarchy is becoming an uncomfortable institution for the current rulers, and that the harmony that existed in other times, for example, with Felipe Gonzalez, no longer exists. I don't know. That should be something for political analysts to analyze, for them to study. However, look, as a jurist, I'll tell you one thing. The king cannot get involved in day-to-day politics because that's not his role. However, the king intervenes at certain specific moments when the state is about to collapse. Don Juan Carlos did it during the coup d'etat, but Don Felipe also did it when there was the Catalan insurrection, and obviously he acted, and all the citizens found ourselves united around him. Someone might ask, what is the monarchy for? Look, I'll tell you, what is the monarchy for? The monarchy is the last stronghold of the rule of law and of the system we have now, of our democratic system. If tomorrow someone wanted, like in Venezuela or as happened in Spain during the Second Republic, to take to the streets and seize the institutions by force, what would I say? Well, I'm not talking about something warlike, a war, a civil conflict, but simply that at a certain moment, millions of Spaniards mobilize, take to the streets, start reciting verses, throw a festival of roses, and want to change the regime. We've seen this, we've seen it. That's what they were trying to do in Catalonia. Exactly, that's the idea behind the Ibarreche plan. I don't know if you remember that in the Basque country. Look, that's absolutely impossible in Spain, because the king would always be against it, and the king could always call on the citizens. Then judges, police, army, journalists would come out to defend our regime. Those seeking to end the regime also want to end the monarchy. That's the key, and that's what the monarchy is for.
I feel positive, and I like that, because we're feeling a bit down with the daily news, with the direction this government is taking that can't win at the polls and tries to do so with the votes of foreigners. By the way, will the Ley de Nietos, which clearly appears to be illegal, be stopped?
Yes, well, the problem with the Ley de Nietos, which dates back to 2022 and isn't something new, is that they're trying to turn it into a loophole precisely through administrative provisions. All right? Let's see. One thing is the law, and another thing is when the politician in power, the current administrative authority, the executive branch, violates it, distorts it, does whatever they want with it. The problem with the Ley de Nietos is that without analyzing each case individually, it's a one-size-fits-all solution. They open the doors and suddenly alter the composition of our voter rolls. And even the very makeup of the Spanish people could be altered. Suddenly, we find ourselves surrounded by so-called compatriots who have nothing to do with us. And it turns out that Spain is delocalized, and it turns out that Spaniards are beyond our borders. But let me tell you, that's a perversion of the law. What the law originally says is that each case should be examined individually, and in those situations where there has been an illegitimate deprivation of nationality, the descendants can keep it. Look, I'm telling you this with absolute sincerity. I don't see that as a bad thing in itself. What I see as bad is the perversion that can be made of the legal text.
Mr. Villegas, we will get through this. I'll stick with that message, right?
But let me tell you, I really appreciate the interview. And please, please, let's not give up. Let's not let ourselves be humiliated. We are much stronger than they are. This is not a problem of right-wing or left-wing ideologies. This is about decent citizens versus criminals. There are more of us. We're stronger. Please, let's spread hope. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Judge. A big hug.
Goodbye. Goodbye. Castillon Confidential.